Okay, D-Man Biker here again. I just felt like making another video. This video is basically just gonna showcase my longest series of tanks, the H21 tank. I originally made this tank to fight Sir Dauber's tank. We basically decided on a gun we'd use, ammo that we'd use, engines that we'd use, and a relative weight class of around 40, I don't know, to 45 tons. And I designed this tank, and he came up with this crazy pike nose son of a bitch tank. That was kind of weird. Anyway, this tank has actually, it's proven to be a very good base for a lot of designs, and I think currently my best tank is also based on the same chassis, and I just want to show you guys the progression and the logic I used in leading up to that point. So yeah, this is the original H21. It's literally called that because it took 21 iterations to finish this tank. I don't actually recall why it was H21 because it's not intended to be a heavy tank, but whatever. It's the H21. It's got it's got a nice lower plate. You might recognize this tank from my sloped armor video. 120mm lower plate, 110mm upper plate. It's got this 200mm stepped thing here. This was a mistake. Don't do this unless you're trying to make it look like another tank. And then it's got a, it's got kind of a weak turret, but there really isn't any ammo in the turret. There's some ammo for the 20mm coaxial autocannon. But other than that, there really isn't that much. The armor is decently strong, but it was found that in combat tests, this plate would get blown off very quickly, which wasn't a huge deal because the ammo's way down in here, but it still is no good to get this blown off because from up higher you could definitely do some damage on the inside of the tank. It runs using a pretty normal power plant, two 20-liter inline 6 engines going into a actually into a dual CVT, I believe, because this was, they actually nerfed, or they buffed CVTs recently, and they used to not be able to support this much torque. So I believe this is actually two CVTs inside each other, but I'm not. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Maybe it's not. I think it is because you can see it looks kind of weird. Whatever, it doesn't matter. And then it goes from this CVT into dual transmissions. So basically, this tank can pivot in place, and I believe it can also reverse the same speed that it can go forward, which kind of is a hallmark of this design until very recently. After I made this tank, I just decided, hey, let's make it into a tank destroyer too, and I made this sexy beast. It's got basically the same hull, but the upper plate's nerfed from 120 to 90mm, but still sloped very well. It looks really sexy from this. Look at this. Just looks awesome. This tank is basically just the same tank with a 120mm gun replacing the 100mm gun, and a lot of ammo. This is very spacious on the inside, but it's basically just a straight up cosmetic upgrade with removal of the turret. Okay, let's go to the next step of the series. Okay, you'll probably recognize this from my sloped armor video again, but this is the H21 A2. The frontal armor profile is all that's changed. The rest of the tank's pretty much exactly the same. The frontal armor was upgraded to a more reasonable design, 250 lower plate with much less sloping than this armor, and then it's got a very well sloped upper plate similar to the other one, and it completely is missing that stepped plate up here. So basically I combined the lower plate with the step plate to raise this plate up, so it no longer has this weak spot. This looks like it's, since this is 250mm thick, it needs to be hit a significant number of times before it can actually get knocked out. So this is perfectly adequate for this tonnage of a tank. The ductility could probably be a bit higher to give it a little bit more health, but this tank actually weighs about 2 tons less than this tank, but the frontal armor is overall more effective. I believe the inside might have been changed. Yeah, this tank, I took away its ability to pivot because it wasn't really needed for this type of tank. Like if you're not gonna have a turret, you really want it to pivot, but without a turret, I would just recommend leaving pivoting out. It takes up a lot of weight to add another transfer case, and and it just kind of wrecks the layout of your tank. The front is also extended a little bit. Like this is a little bit longer. That's why there's an extra plate here. Apparently, I didn't actually armor this area, but I did not find that to be an issue in tests. Also, this tank is the first tank I have that uses dual ammunition types. It can fire HE and AP, and you can toggle between them on the fly. It's kind of awkward, the system I use for switching ammo, so it's not perfect, but it's actually very effective. If you can fire HE right into the side of someone, you can do a lot of damage to a tank, and lighter tanks just get shredded by this stuff, especially larger HE shells. For just 100mm cannons, it's not huge, but larger cannons, it can cause a lot of damage. So basically this is just a basic armor upgrade to the original tank. This is a very effective 40-ton tank, just in a normal dogfight against an equivalent tank, but otherwise it's nothing really special. Okay, let's go on to the next version of the tank. Okay, here's where things start to get sexy, and where things start to get a little weird. This is the H21 A4. I skipped the A3 because it was basically just the A2 with a pleak armor and a few other differences with the transmission. This is, believe it or not, the same chassis as this tank. In my quest to get more armor out of the front, I realized there was a lot of dead space up in the top here. I mean, I could fit more ammo and stuff, but it really isn't necessary to have this huge area here, especially because this creates a much stronger, another area that really needs to be armored more. So I decided, hey, let's just cut that off. So this is the H21 A4. I like to call it a razied tank. I like to say I razied it like like an old ship of the line. I cut the top deck off. It looks pretty primal with this turret on it. It looks kind of weird. It looks kind of like a weird T-72, like Centurion hybrid or something. This tank has ridiculous frontal armor. It's actually massively overkill. This later versions of this tank have less frontal armor. This lower plate is actually angled back at 30 degrees. That's far more than even this plate is. 30 degrees. 250mm of armor. That means this lower plate has roughly 500mm of effective armor, and the upper plate's 100mm, sloped back at, I believe, 81mm. That's over 600 effective. That's insane. The main issue with this tank is that since it's much shorter than the other tank, I could not fit all the ammunition I needed in the tank, so I had to put more ammo in the turret than usual. I had to put, what the fuck? Wait a second. Oh, this ammo crate here is glitching out. There's supposed to be 3 HE shells in each of these, but whatever. I had to put 6 HE shells in the turret, which is a problem because the turret is not very well armored. I mean, I up-armored the turret, but flat plates at 200mm isn't super strong. You could probably get by if you made higher ductility on these, but it really doesn't. This turret is not big enough or well armored enough for this design, really. This is a very strong frontal plate, though. This thing, if you're fighting another 40-ton with a 100mm gun, this plate, you can't really penetrate this plate. If I raise the ductility on this and lowered armor elsewhere, this plate is basically a no-go zone. Same with this plate. This plate doesn't even need to be 100mm. It could be like 50mm, and everything would just bounce off of it. The main weaknesses on this tank are these sides, which I believe the sides are 50mm effective. You've got the wheels really don't count as armor at all. You got a 30mm plate over this plate, and the inside is actually 50mm. I guess it's 80mm effective. That's almost excessive. Whatever. But yeah, this is the last version of this tank to feature this turret, so say goodbye to this turret in the next tank. Okay, this is where things start to get real. This is the Super H21, as I dubbed it. It is a upgunned version of this tank. It was upgunned and upweighted to 50 tons from 40 tons, and it carries a 120 millimeter gun. Uh, there are some issues with having a 120 millimeter gun, and that's that the 120 millimeter ammo doesn't effectively fit inside this chassis. Originally, I did have ammo on the sides, like you saw before in this tank, but I found that the sides are just far too weak. I had to lower the side armor even more on this tank in order to fit the larger gun and heavily armored turret. So you have about, I believe there's 60 millimeters of side armor, and it just often shells would just come through the side and hit those. So I got rid of, basically this is just all empty space. The original actually had a transmission. The original did use the same transmission system as this, only without pivoting, so it could go in reverse at the same speed as going forward. But I actually nixed that in the final version and just went to a single CVT attached to the same engines, which give it plenty of power. And this is just a basic CVT. It cannot pivot and it cannot drive in reverse the same speed that it goes forward. But that gave me a massive amount more room inside the tank to work with, so I could fit my seat right in the middle here. So before I had issues where shells would come through the side and either hit the seat and knock it out, or they would hit my extra ammo on the side of the tank and knock out the ammo immediately, because I stored all my HE in the bottom of the tank. But having it this way, I could move my seat back and I could store 4 HE shells, 120 millimeter, right at the front, along with my fuel. And the front's still very well armored. And then the rest of my ammo is actually stored in the turret. So this tank follows a more kind of American sort of design where most of the ammo is actually in the turret, though this does lead to issues because this means the turret requires very heavy armor. I solved that issue in kind of a weird way. Basically, I lowered the lower plate armor to 175 millimeters from that whopping 250 you saw before. Though, if we look at our effective armor calculator, that's still 367 millimeters effective. Most shells are still going to bounce off of this lower plate, even at 175 millimeters. And the upper plate, I nerfed to 65 millimeters, which, it's real main battle tanks. You know, they have an insane slope like this, like 80 degrees or so. And they often have, you know, like the Abrams has like 60 millimeters up here. I believe the slope's at like 81 degrees. And it looks like mine's at 81 degrees too. So 65 millimeters actually is 415 millimeters effective. So that's okay. But the shells bounce straight into the turret. And that leads to the main issue with this tank. This tank weighs 49.8 tons. And that's because of the turret. See, if we look at our armor thing here, that's almost completely unsloped armor, and it has effective armor of 1,000 millimeters. I found when fighting Sir Dauberts that he could just shoot through the front of my turret. Like, if he shot it enough, even though he was using a 100 millimeter gun, he was able to knock all these plates out. So I basically had to add high ductility plates, just going back, with massive thicknesses in this thing, so it's insanely thick on the front of the turret. This would take forever to go through. But then that makes other vulnerabilities in the sides of the turret, which are 250 millimeters thick, 390 effective with angling. So it's just all these issues. I had to lower my armor massive amounts on the sides, the top of the turret, things like that. There was an issue at one point where you could just shoot through the top of the turret and blow up all the ammo. So I had to raise the armor and mess with the ductility and various other things, and it just wasn't working out. This turret is just too heavy, and just armoring this, it just doesn't work. I know in my sloped armor video I kind of implied that a flat plate is okay, but not a small flat plate, because this thing will just soak up so many hits that it will be knocked out fairly quickly. So you really want to deflect as much energy away from your armor as possible, and you can do that with sloped armor. I was more trying to say that you don't need massive heavy pancake slopes on your tank in order to deflect shells and take hits. Anyway, now we're going to look at the final iteration of this tank, which I think is probably going to be the final version of this tank because it performs very well. Alright, here it is. The Super H21B. This might just be the sexiest turret I've ever made. This thing is like the first tank. I mean, this was a pretty sexy turret, but this turret is like, woohoo. I'll be honest, this tank isn't quite done. There's some aesthetic details that haven't actually been worked out, but the main hull is the same as the H21 A4. You know, it's got this flat hull with the top raising off, and then you've got this sexy sloped turret. Just look at this thing. It's got like a legitimate gun mount too. Like this actually, there's actually a hole in the turret here where the gun comes through, which I thought was pretty cool. Basically, this turret weighs quite a bit less than the other turret, so I was able to increase armor in other places due to the sloping. I didn't need that massive thick mantlet in order to deflect shells off my armor, because I didn't have shells coming in like this and just smashing into the armor, doing all the damage they can. Shells instead hit, and they do smash into the armor and do damage, but they deflect a lot of that energy away from the armor. If we pull out our armor properties tool, we've got 200 millimeters slope back at, I don't know what it's sloped back at. I guess it's sloped back at close to 30 degrees, 59, you know, 59 to like 60 degrees, which would be, you know what I'm saying. It's close to giving me about a 2 times increase in armor thickness, so I have about 400 effective on the raw. This chip gets a little bit messed up by ductility values, but these are high ductility 200 millimeter thick plates. That way they don't get destroyed. Sir Daubers and I looked into it, and it seems like when you go into high levels of ductility, it doesn't seem to matter. It implies in all the it's hard to explain. Sir Daubers would probably do it better, but it implies in all the documentation and stuff for ACF that higher ductility should make your armor easier to penetrate, but we tested fairly extensively, and the risk, like the reward for having higher ductility versus lower ductility just favors higher ductility. You want higher health, just make your ductility higher, and don't even worry about having low ductility unless you're only if you're trying to save weight, and on your side armor do you need low ductility. Your front armor, just make it as high as you can, and it'll be better because shells will bounce off of it no matter what, if it's angled right. Anyway, after that little rant, we've got 200 millimeters on the upper. Sides of the turret are actually only 50 millimeters, but if something hits this, it's going to bounce off. Those could be 20 millimeters, and it would probably bounce off. Let's see here. So, got it lined up here. It's 50 millimeters of armor. It says 262 millimeters of effective armor, but it's hitting at an 80-degree angle. That no one's gonna aim there. It's gonna bounce off. Then you do have kind of a shot trap here, but it didn't lead to any issues. I don't know. Theoretically, the shots could bounce off this and go into the tank, but there's nothing here. Like, there's nothing to hit. All the ammo and stuff is up in the front. I mean, you could just maybe shoot it under the gun, but probably not. You're gonna hit the gun most likely, so it's not really an issue. But yeah, the bottom of the turret is, I believe, 100 millimeters thick. It might be 80 millimeters thick now. Looks like it's yeah, it's at an insane angle. It's at almost 80 degrees of angling, and it's 80 millimeters. Originally, I was gonna have like a Merkava tank style gun mantlet that would move with the gun, but I found the way the gun's mounted right now, it just perfectly goes through this slot. It's just so perfect. Like, there's almost no clipping at all. Maybe it clips a tiny bit up here, but who cares? Top of the turret's 35 millimeters, which is actually stronger than the previous tank, so that's good. It's got the ductility set up so if someone shoots the top from a high angle, as long as they're not like way up here or something, it should not go through. So very good armor on the turret, and the ammo is much better protected now. I added a 20 millimeter MG for a coax. It actually fires with roughly the same muzzle velocity as the HE shells, because my HE shells are very low velocity on this thing. They only leave the gun at about 300 meters per second, so they're difficult to aim at long range. So I kind of made this coax a sighting gun with tracers. So because I don't really want to use an expression that aims the gun for me on this tank. Anyway, having a lighter turret made it so I could increase my frontal hull armor again, so I actually buffed the lower plate to 200 millimeters, which is still less than the whopping 250 millimeters on my 40-ton version of this tank, but it still is an enormous, close to 500 millimeters of effective armor. I mean, if you took the exact values, this is 30 degrees of slope. This is about 400 millimeters effective armor just in raw values if you ignore ductility and stuff. Oh, look, there's a little hole or whatever. But this is a very high ductility plate, so it's very high health, which, as I said before, like it does not appear to matter, at least not with all the tests that we had, which could have been flawed, I don't know. And then the upper plate is 80 millimeters. It used to be 65 on the previous version, but I was able to raise it to 80 millimeters, which is perfectly sufficient for a plate that is angled back at that angle. We're reading at over 500 millimeters of effective armor. The increased effectiveness is over 5 times, so this is insane. I mean, there could be a shot trap potentially. I guess a shell could bounce off this and maybe hit the turret. I don't know. The turret is pretty far back. It would be pretty difficult for that to happen. Let's see. Yeah, I just don't think that a shell could have enough force to keep moving that far. I don't think it's an issue. It would bounce off and then it would deflect. It's 150 millimeters, and right behind it is a 80 millimeter heavy angle. I'm not too worried about that happening, but potentially maybe that could be an issue. Anyway, I fought Sir Dauber's Abrams in this tank. This is a 49.2 ton tank. His tank was about, I think, 47 tons, so it was a little bit lighter than mine, and he actually ran out of ammo before causing any significant damage to my tank. One shell went through the side of my tank, and I think it hit my engine or something. I couldn't figure out after the battle, but somehow my tank was not driving correctly, but he ran completely out of ammo, and I ran out of ammo too, but I had 2 HE shells left, and I was able to put a strong HE shell right into the side of his tank, which blew it up, because these tanks really don't have strong side armor at all. This tank actually has reduced side armor. I think I mentioned that before. Turret side is only 50 millimeters, but if you're facing the side of your turret towards your enemy, you're going to die, because that means there's probably something wrong with your chip. And then this outer plate here is 20 millimeters, and then the inside is 40 millimeters, so it's like 60 effective. The wheels don't really have any armor at all, but they have very high ductility. I set their ductility as high as they could go with making the mass around 100, because they're supposed to weigh 100 each, so I have a huge, almost 500 hit points on these wheels, which helps me survive some HE hits, things like that. I think it's pretty useful to do this. These are make spherical, that's why the health is so ridiculously high, because make spherical heavily increases the total area the prop takes up. Anyway, that I think pretty much covers what's going on with my tanks right now, and I really like this tank. Sexy tank. Right now I do admit the driving system isn't very good. I'm literally just using weld latches to turn, because I ran into some issues really early on with the drive system on this tank, and I just never fixed it, because it drives just fine using the weld latches, so why would I fix it? That may have looked like it didn't drive just fine, but I just had a little glitch there. But yeah, it's got a strong gun, 120 millimeter. I believe it's got 250 millimeters of pen with AP. I prefer not to use APHE ammo, because you sacrifice a lot of penetration, and oftentimes if you're shooting against high ductility props, you just won't do any damage. I've seen one time Nick's tank took like repeated hits over and over again from a 140 millimeter armed, like 70-ton tank, his Abrams, and he didn't even lose his frontal plate because they were just blowing up against his armor. This thing also fires HE. Right there, that was an AP shell, because the breach didn't clear correctly. It takes a really long time to reload anyway, so. But yeah, these HE shells are huge, and then I've got my coaxial gun, which fires at the same velocity as HE, but this map is not very big. The gun's stabilized, but it's stabilized with Nick's version of Spider's chip, so the turret rotation is limited by the by the actual speed the turret can turn, it will not turn necessarily as fast as you're moving the tank. It's just that this turret can turn this fast, so you know. But yeah, this tank is still WIP. It's not done. Sometimes the breach kind of pops through the top of the turret when you go over a hill, and that's just, you know, it doesn't depress that far normally. It's just when you go over hills. That's something that I can fix later. It just hasn't been the primary goal at this time. And then yeah, that's pretty much it. The main issue with these heavier versions of this tank is gun depression. This tank has -5, maybe even -4 degrees of gun depression. The original tank, I believe, had -8. So that's the main downside with using the bigger gun on these shorter tanks. But other than that, I think this is a pretty good tank. But I also might not know how to design ACF tanks. I don't know. Have a good one.